The morning fog hangs heavy over the North Sea. A line of ships appears on the horizon, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the mist like specters from another world. Their oars, moving in perfect unison, propel them forward with unnerving precision. While the Anglo-Saxons built walls of stone and timber to protect their kingdoms, the Northmen were building a different kind of future, one that would stretch across oceans and continents, from the fjords of Norway to the steppes of Russia, from the green shores of Ireland to the sun-baked coasts of Sicily and beyond. This is the tale of how a people from the cold edge of Europe reshaped the medieval world through courage, craftsmanship, and an unquenchable thirst for discovery. Before we begin this journey into the Viking Age, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It's always fascinating to see our community of history lovers spread across the world. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and enable notifications. Every subscription helps us keep exploring the real stories behind the legends. Now, let's begin. The year is 1066. As William the Conqueror prepares his invasion fleet on the shores of Normandy, England stands as a land of timber and stone fortifications, a landscape transformed by generations of defensive architecture. But the Norman invasion represents more than just a change in England's ruling class. It marks the culmination of nearly 3 centuries during which the Norse peoples, those we call Vikings, had been weaving themselves into the very fabric of European civilization and beyond. This is the story of how, while England was building walls, the descendants of Odin were building a world. The world before the Viking expansion was one of isolated kingdoms, of communities that rarely ventured beyond their known territories. In England, the political landscape was fragmented into competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, and others, each fighting for supremacy in the wake of Roman withdrawal. Their kings built burhs, fortified settlements designed to protect their people from Welsh and Pictish raiders, and increasingly, from each other. The countryside was dotted with these defensive structures, earthen ramparts surrounded by ditches, topped with wooden palisades, sheltering communities from the uncertainties that plagued the early medieval world. Across the Channel, the Frankish realms that would one day become France and Germany were experiencing a different kind of transformation. Under Charlemagne, crowned Emperor of the Romans in 800, centralized power was growing. Yet even this mighty empire relied on fortified positions to maintain control over its vast territories. The very word palace derives from the Palatine Hill in Rome, but in Charlemagne's time it had come to mean a defensible residence, a place where power could be exercised from behind protective walls. But as the Anglo-Saxons and Franks looked inward, constructing ever more elaborate defensive networks, a different reality was unfolding across the cold waters of the North Sea. In the harsh landscapes of Scandinavia, a people was being forged by necessity and ambition. The Norse did not begin as a unified culture, but as scattered communities across Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, each adapted to the unforgiving environment of the north. Their settlements clung to the edges of fjords and valleys, wherever fertile soil could support crops during the brief northern summer. Unlike their southerly neighbors, they built no great stone fortresses. Their strength lay not in walls, but in mobility, not in defense, but in bold advance. The Norse homeland was a place of stark beauty and harsh realities. Towering mountains plunged directly into deep fjords in Norway, creating a fractured coastline where travel by sea was often easier than by land. In Sweden, countless lakes and dense forests created natural barriers between communities, while Denmark's flatter landscape and numerous islands made it a natural crossroads for maritime trade. The growing season was short, the winters long and dark. In the northernmost settlements, the sun would disappear entirely for weeks during midwinter, while midsummer brought the phenomenon of the midnight sun, when darkness never fully fell. In this environment, communities had to be largely self-sufficient, yet interconnected through networks of trade and kinship. Archaeological evidence from settlements across Scandinavia reveals a material culture that was both practical and aesthetically sophisticated. The longhouses that served as the primary dwelling for Norse families combined living spaces for humans and livestock under one roof, a practical arrangement that conserved heat during the bitter winter months. These structures, with their central hearths and smoke holes in the roof, were the setting for much of Norse daily life: the preparation of food, the crafting of tools and textiles, the telling of stories during the long, dark winters, and the celebration of seasonal festivals. The sagas tell us that these were people for whom courage was the highest virtue, men and women who believed that their fate was woven by the Norns at birth, leaving only the question of how gloriously they would meet it. They lived in longhouses of timber and thatch, their communities governed by things, assemblies where freemen could speak and where law was administered. Their religious world was populated by gods who were powerful but not omnipotent, gods who would themselves fall at Ragnarok, the twilight of their reign. In this worldview, even divine beings were subject to fate, and the highest achievement was not to escape destiny, but to face it with courage. The Norse pantheon reflected the values and concerns of the people who worshipped them. Odin, the All-Father, was not merely a god of war, but of wisdom, poetry, and magic, a complex deity who had sacrificed his eye at Mimir's well in exchange for knowledge, and who had hung himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to gain the secrets of the runes. Thor, with his mighty hammer Mjolnir, was the protector of both gods and humans against the chaotic forces of the Jötnar, the giants. Freyr and Freya, the divine twins, embodied fertility and prosperity. Loki, the trickster, represented both the creative and destructive potential of chaos. These were not remote, perfect beings, but flawed, passionate figures whose stories resonated with the complexities of human experience. Religious practice was integrated into daily life, rather than confined to separate sacred spaces. While there were temples, known as hofs, much of Norse religious activity took place in the home or in natural settings, sacred groves, distinctive rock formations, or beside bodies of water. Rituals marked the turning of the seasons, especially the critical moments of midwinter and midsummer. Sacrifices, called blot, could range from offerings of food and drink to the gods to the more dramatic sacrifice of animals, or, in rare and extreme cases, if the sagas are to be believed, humans. But the aim was always the same: to maintain the favor of the gods and ensure the continuation of the cosmic order upon which human prosperity depended. What set the Norse apart, what would make them Vikings, was not simply their beliefs or social structures, but their mastery of maritime technology. While the Anglo-Saxons were perfecting the brewer, a defensive innovation that would culminate in the modern Bailey castles of the Norman period, the shipwrights of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were refining a vessel that would change history, the longship. These vessels were marvels of engineering, with flexible hulls that could ride ocean swells, yet draw so little water that they could be beached on any shore or navigate far up rivers. They combined sail power with oars, making them independent of wind direction and capable of surprising speed. The longship was not merely a means of transportation, it was a revolution in mobility that opened the world to Norse exploration and conquest. The craftsmen who built these vessels worked without written plans, relying instead on inherited knowledge and a profound understanding of materials. Each strake, each plank of the hull, was split from an oak trunk, following the grain for maximum strength. The overlapping planks were fastened with iron rivets, the seams made waterproof with tarred wool or animal hair. The mast could be raised or lowered depending on wind conditions, and the square sail, woven from wool and sometimes decorated with distinctive stripes, could propel the vessel at speeds of up to 10 knots in favorable winds. When winds were unfavorable or absent, the crew would take to the oars with every man except the steersman and lookout pulling his weight. The resulting craft was a perfect synthesis of form and function. The shallow draft allowed the longship to navigate both open seas and inland waterways, making possible the distinctive Viking tactic of appearing seemingly out of nowhere to strike targets far from the coast. The flexibility of the hull, which would have seemed alarmingly unstable to sailors accustomed to more rigid vessels, actually made the longship more seaworthy, allowing it to ride over waves rather than fighting against them. And the combination of sail and oar power gave the Vikings tactical options that their victims often lacked: the ability to approach under sail, then switch to oars for the final assault, achieving surprise and maintaining maneuverability in the critical moments of an attack. While stone keeps and timber palisades were rising across England, anchored immovably to the land, the Norse were creating the most advanced, mobile technology of their age. The contrast could not have been more stark, one culture investing in fixed positions, the other in the ability to move swiftly and strike unexpectedly. The Vikings' famous dragon-headed prows, which may have been reserved for the ships of chieftains or kings, were not merely decorative but symbolic, announcing to all who saw them that these were not ordinary sailors, but warriors who claimed descent from mythical beings who carried the spirit of their fierce ancestors with them as they ventured into unknown waters. What drove these people to leave their homeland? The traditional explanation has focused on overpopulation and limited resources, the pressure of too many sons on too little land. In a society where inheritance typically passed to the eldest son, younger sons faced limited prospects at home. The choice was stark: remain as a dependent member of the family farm, seek service with a more powerful figure as a herdmaður, household troop, or look for opportunities elsewhere. For many, especially those of restless temperament or ambitious nature, the third option was the most appealing. More recent scholarship has suggested a more complex picture, one that includes political changes in Scandinavia. In Norway, the late 8th century saw the rise of Harald Fairhair, whose campaigns to unite the country under his rule may have driven many independent-minded jarls and their followers to seek freedom elsewhere. The Egil's saga tells the story of one such family, that of Kveldulf and his sons, who fled Norway rather than submit to Harald's authority. In Denmark, similar processes of kingdom-building were underway. The consolidation of power meant that those unwilling to submit had to find new horizons. Climate may have played a role as well. The early Viking Age coincided with what climatologists call the medieval warm period, when temperatures across northern Europe were somewhat higher than in preceding centuries. This climate shift would have made longer voyages more feasible, opening sea routes that might previously have been too hazardous. It also would have improved agricultural yields in Scandinavia, potentially supporting population growth that created pressure for expansion. The relative warmth of this period made possible the settlement of Iceland and Greenland, areas that would have been even more marginal for agriculture in colder times. But perhaps most important was opportunity. The Vikings did not sail blindly into the unknown. They were following established trade routes, seeking wealth in lands they already knew existed. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria had grown rich from its monasteries and trade. Francia under Charlemagne was accumulating unprecedented wealth. The Islamic world was flourishing, with silver flowing north through trading networks. The Norse were not fleeing poverty but pursuing prosperity, and they had the perfect tool to do so in their longships. Trading had long been a part of Norse life. Archaeological evidence shows that even before the Viking Age properly began, there were established networks of exchange throughout the Baltic region and beyond. Scandinavian merchants traded furs, walrus ivory, amber, and other northern goods for silver, glass, fine textiles, and other luxuries for more southerly regions. What changed in the late 8th century was not the existence of trade, but its character and scale. Peaceful exchange increasingly gave way to raid and conquest, though it would be a mistake to see these as entirely separate activities. The same Norse band might trade peacefully in one port and raid another, depending on the opportunities and risks presented. The first recorded Viking raid on England struck the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records, "In this year dire portents appeared over Northumbria." And a little after that, on the 6th day before the Ides of January, the ravaging of heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through brutal robbery and slaughter. While this attack has come to symbolize the beginning of the Viking Age, it was likely not the first Norse venture to British shores. What made Lindisfarne different was that it targeted not a trading settlement or minor coastal community, but one of the most sacred sites of Anglo-Saxon Christianity. Lindisfarne, also known as Holy Island, lies just off the coast of Northumbria in northeast England. Founded in the 7th century by the Irish monk Aidan, it had become a center of Christian learning and art, producing treasures like the Lindisfarne Gospels, an illuminated manuscript of extraordinary beauty and craftsmanship. The monastery was wealthy, but essentially defenseless, its inhabitants monks rather than warriors. The Vikings who came upon it that January day would have found rich pickings and little resistance. The raid was brutal but brief, a sudden assault followed by a swift retreat to the sea, carrying with them gold, silver, and captives who could be sold as slaves. The psychological impact was profound. Alcuin of York, the great Anglo-Saxon scholar who served at Charlemagne's court, wrote, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God." This was not merely a raid, it was a cultural shock that reverberated throughout Christian Europe. While the Anglo-Saxons were building earthworks and timber fortifications to defend against traditional enemies, a new threat had emerged from the sea, one that their defensive strategies were ill-equipped to counter. Lindisfarne was only the beginning. In the years that followed, Viking raiders struck repeatedly at monasteries and coastal settlements throughout the British Isles. Iona, the sacred center of Celtic Christianity, was attacked in 795, 802, and 806, with many monks slaughtered and others carried off into slavery. Jarrow, where the Venerable Bede had written his ecclesiastical history of the English people, was raided in 794. Recru, probably modern Rathlin Island off the coast of Ireland, was hit in 795. These early attacks shared a common pattern. They targeted wealthy religious communities that were poorly defended and often located on islands or coastal sites for the very isolation that had once protected them from mainland troubles, but now made them vulnerable to seaborne raiders. The early raids followed a pattern: swift attacks on wealthy but poorly defended targets, followed by equally swift withdrawals before local forces could respond. Monasteries were particular targets, not only because they held valuable treasures, illuminated manuscripts, gold and silver chalices, reliquaries studded with precious stones, but because they were typically unfortified. While secular leaders focused on defending their territories against neighboring kingdoms with walls and garrisons, religious communities remained vulnerable. The same pattern was evident on the continent. In 799, the monastery of St. Philibert on the island of Noirmoutier off the French coast was attacked. In 820, Vikings raided the mouth of the Seine, and in 834, they struck at the wealthy trading center of Dorestad in what is now the Netherlands. These raids were not random, but targeted at sites known to be wealthy and vulnerable. The Vikings were not exploring blindly, but following intelligence about where riches could be found with minimal risk. As the 9th century progressed, Viking activity intensified and evolved. What had begun as seasonal raids became year-round campaigns. In 851, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that for the first time, a Viking force wintered in England on the Isle of Thanet. This marked a significant shift. The Norse were no longer simply raiders, but were establishing footholds for more permanent presence. By 865, a force known as the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia, and over the next decade it would campaign throughout England, defeating 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Great Heathen Army, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called it, represented a new scale and organization of Viking activity. Traditional accounts suggest it was led by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, including Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba, seeking revenge for their father's death at the hands of King Ella of Northumbria. While the historicity of Ragnar himself is debated, archaeological evidence confirms the presence of a large, well-organized Viking force in England during this period. The army was not a single unified entity but a coalition of bands under different leaders, united temporarily for greater impact. Its size is uncertain, with estimates ranging from several hundred to several thousand warriors, but whatever its numerical strength, its military effectiveness is beyond doubt. The army's campaign was methodical and strategic, landing first in East Anglia, where they were able to negotiate a settlement that included the provision of horses. They then struck north at York, the capital of Northumbria. Internal divisions within Northumbria facilitated their conquest. The kingdom was torn by civil strife between rival claimants to the throne. The Vikings exploited these divisions, capturing York in 866 with relative ease. Having secured this major urban center, which they renamed Jorvik, they turned their attention to Mercia and then to Wessex. Only Wessex, under the leadership of Alfred the Great, would successfully resist. Alfred's strategy combined military innovation with defensive infrastructure. He reorganized the Fyrd, the Anglo-Saxon militia, into a more professional force. He built a navy to counter Viking sea power. And critically, he expanded the system of burhs, fortified settlements strategically placed, so that no location in Wessex was more than a day's journey from a defensive stronghold. While Alfred's innovations would ultimately save Wessex, much of northern and eastern England fell under Norse control, becoming the area known as the Danelaw. Alfred's burhs were more than military installations. They were planned settlements with street grids, markets, and mints, designed to serve as centers of both defense and economic activity. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that Alfred commanded to be built a fortress with all speed at Athelney, and after his victory over the Vikings at Edington in 878, commanded to be built another fortress at Wareham. These fortifications were part of a comprehensive system that combined fixed defenses with mobile forces, allowing Alfred to counter the Viking advantage of mobility. The Treaty of Wedmore in 878 established a boundary between Alfred's Wessex and the Danelaw, with the Viking leader Guthrum accepting baptism as part of the agreement. This was not the end of conflict. Viking raids would continue, and Alfred's successors would eventually reconquer the Danelaw, but it marked a transition from raid to settlement. The Vikings who remained in England began to integrate with the local population, adopting aspects of Anglo-Saxon culture while maintaining elements of their own identity. But England was just one theater in a much broader expansion. While the Anglo-Saxons were learning the art of castle building from their continental neighbors, Viking longships were carrying Norse explorers, traders, and settlers across astonishing distances. To the west, they reached Iceland by the 870s, establishing a society that would preserve Norse culture and literature for centuries after it had been transformed elsewhere. By the end of the 10th century, they had reached Greenland, where Eric the Red established a colony that would last for nearly 500 years. The settlement of Iceland represents one of the most remarkable achievements of the Viking Age. This volcanic island, lying some 500 miles west of Norway, had been visited by Irish monks before the Norse arrival, but it was the Vikings who established permanent settlements beginning around 874. The Landnámabók, or Book of Settlements, compiled centuries later, records the names and claims of the first settlers, tracing the lineage of later Icelanders back to these founding figures. While the details of these accounts may have been embellished over time, archaeological evidence confirms the Norse settlement pattern described in the texts. Iceland was settled primarily by Norwegians, many of them leaving to escape the growing power of Harald Fairhair. They brought with them not only their material culture, their building techniques, their agricultural practices, their crafts, but also their social and legal systems. The absence of an indigenous population meant that Norse customs could be transplanted with relatively little adaptation, creating what has been called a Viking Age time capsule that preserved elements of the original culture long after they had evolved or disappeared in the Scandinavian homeland. The most significant innovation of Icelandic society was its political structure. In the absence of a king or overlord, the settlers established the Althing, an annual assembly where disputes were settled and laws made. While not fully democratic in the modern sense, power still rested primarily with the Godar, the chieftain priests who led local communities. The Althing represented a remarkable experiment in self-governance. It has been called the world's oldest parliamentary institution, having been established in 930 and continuing to the present day, though with significant changes in form and function over the centuries. And if the Icelandic sagas are to be believed, around the year 1000, Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, made landfall in North America, a place they called Vinland. Archaeological evidence at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland confirms a Norse presence in North America centuries before Columbus. While European castle architecture was still in its formative stages, the Vikings had already crossed the Atlantic, a feat that would not be repeated by Europeans for another 500 years. The Norse presence in North America was brief. The settlement at Lonso Meadows appears to have been occupied for only a few years around the year 1000, and limited in scope. The sagas mention encounters with indigenous people, whom the Norse called Skraelingar, and suggest that hostile interactions may have contributed to the abandonment of the settlement. But the very fact that the Vikings reached North America, establishing, however temporary, a presence there, testifies to their extraordinary maritime capabilities and their willingness to venture into unknown territories. To the east, Swedish Vikings, known as Rus, pushed deep into the river systems of what is now Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. By the mid-9th century, they had established trading posts that would grow into major cities, including Novgorod and Kiev. The primary chronicle, a history of Kievan Rus, compiled in the early 12th century, records how the local Slavic and Finnic tribes invited the Rus to rule over them. "Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." While this account certainly simplifies a complex process of political development, archaeological and linguistic evidence confirms the significant Norse influence in the early formation of the Rus's state. The Rus exploited the network of rivers that flow through the Great Plains of Eastern Europe, using them as highways for trade and conquest. The Volga, the Dnieper, the Dwina, and their tributaries provided access to a vast territory connecting the Baltic Sea with the Black and Caspian Seas. The Rus would navigate downstream in their longships, portaging when necessary between river systems, to reach the wealthy markets of the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates. Archaeological finds at trading centers like Staraya Ladoga, founded in the mid-8th century, reveal a mix of Scandinavian and local artifacts, testifying to the cultural exchange that accompanied economic activity. From these eastern outposts, the Rus traveled further, navigating the Volga and Dnieper rivers to reach the Black and Caspian Seas. They traded with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic caliphates, exchanging furs, honey, wax, and slaves for silver, silk, and spices. The Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who encountered Rus traders on the Volga in 922, left a detailed and often unflattering account of their customs and appearance. He described them as the filthiest of Allah's creatures, but also noted their impressive physical stature and their elaborate funeral practices, including the sacrifice of a slave girl at the funeral of a chieftain. Ibn Fadlan's account, for all its cultural biases, provides a rare contemporary description of the Rus. He writes of men tall as date palms, with reddish hair and fair skin, their bodies decorated with intricate tattoos. He describes their ships, their weapons, and their hygiene practices, which he found lacking by the standards of Islamic cleanliness. Most famously, he records a Rus funeral he witnessed, in which a chieftain was buried in his ship along with grave goods and a slave girl who volunteered to join her master in death. The girl was given intoxicating drink, ritually raped by the men of the community, and then strangled and stabbed while the ship was set ablaze. While the details of this account may have been influenced by Ibn Fadlan's own cultural preconceptions and the challenges of communication through interpreters, archaeological evidence from ship burials in Scandinavia supports the general outline of his description. The Rus did not only trade with the Byzantine Empire, but also attempted to conquer it. In 860, a Rus fleet attacked Constantinople, catching the city unprepared while Emperor Michael III was away fighting the Arabs. Though this attack was ultimately repelled, it marked the beginning of a complex relationship between the Rus and Byzantium that would include both military conflict and diplomatic alliance. Later, Rus attacks on Constantinople occurred in 907, 941, and 1043, though none succeeded in taking the city. In the south, Norse adventurers found service as mercenaries in the Byzantine Empire, where they were known as the Varangian Guard. These elite troops served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors from the late 10th century until the 13th century. They were valued for their loyalty. As foreigners, they had no stake in local political intrigues, and for their fearsome reputation in battle. One of the most famous members of the Varangian Guard was Harald Hardrada, who would later become King of Norway and die attempting to conquer England in 1066, just weeks before William the Conqueror's successful invasion. The Varangian Guard was formally established in 988, when the Byzantine Emperor Basil II requested military assistance from Vladimir I of Kiev. Vladimir sent 6,000 warriors who helped Basil defeat his rivals in the civil war, then raging. These Rus fighters formed the nucleus of what would become the Varangian Guard. Over time, the composition of the Guard evolved, with Anglo-Saxons joining in significant numbers after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, as dispossessed nobles and warriors sought service abroad rather than submit to Norman rule. But the Norse character of the unit remained strong, as did its reputation for fierce loyalty and fighting prowess. Service in the Varangian Guard offered opportunities for wealth and advancement that would have been unattainable in Scandinavia. The Byzantine Empire was one of the richest and most sophisticated states of the medieval world, with a level of urban development, artistic achievement, and administrative complexity that far surpassed anything in Northern Europe. Guards received not only regular pay, but also the opportunity to participate in the distribution of booty after successful campaigns. Many returned to their homelands with considerable wealth, as evidenced by Byzantine coins found in Scandinavian hoards from this period. Other Norse warriors traveled even further, finding opportunities in the complex politics of the Mediterranean. In the early 11th century, a group of Norman adventurers, themselves descendants of Vikings who had settled in Normandy, arrived in southern Italy. Over the next several decades, they carved out principalities for themselves, eventually unifying them into the Kingdom of Sicily, which included not only the island, but much of southern Italy as well. Under rulers like Roger II, this kingdom became one of the most sophisticated states in Europe, a place where Norman, Byzantine, and Islamic cultures blended to create something new and remarkable. The Norman conquest of southern Italy and Sicily represents a fascinating extension of Viking influence, though one that had evolved considerably from its roots. These were not pagan raiders, but Christian knights, not speakers of Old Norse, but of a French dialect. Yet they carried with them something of the Viking spirit of adventure and conquest, as well as the practical political flexibility that had allowed the Norse to adapt to diverse circumstances across their expanding world. Under Roger II, 1130-1154, the Kingdom of Sicily became a model of multicultural governance, where Greek, Arab, Jewish, and Norman elements coexisted in relative harmony, creating a distinctive civilization that drew on multiple traditions. All of this expansive activity was occurring while the art of castle building was developing in Western Europe. The first motte and bailey castles, earth mounds topped with wooden towers, surrounded by ditches and palisades, were appearing in France in the 10th century. By the early 11th century, this style of fortification had spread to England, particularly after the Norman conquest, when William built castles to secure his hold on his new kingdom. Stone keeps would follow, becoming increasingly sophisticated through the 12th century and beyond. The Motte and Bailey Castle represented a significant innovation in defensive architecture. The motte was an artificial or natural mound, typically 5 to 10 meters high, topped with a wooden or stone tower. The bailey was an enclosed courtyard adjacent to the motte, surrounded by a ditch and palisade where the everyday activities of the castle community took place. This design offered multiple layers of defense. Attackers would first have to breach the outer palisade, then face defenders on the elevated motte. The construction of these fortifications required substantial labor and resources, but they provided a secure base from which a relatively small force could control the surrounding territory. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, William the Conqueror and his followers introduced this continental castle design to England on a large scale. The Tower of London, originally built as a wooden motte and bailey structure and later rebuilt in stone, is perhaps the most famous example. These castles were not merely defensive structures, but symbols of Norman authority, visible reminders of the new regime's power. They were typically positioned at strategic locations, near river crossings, at the intersection of important routes, or overlooking key settlements, to maximize their military and administrative utility. But while European nobility was investing in these immobile defenses, Viking mobility was reshaping the known world. The contrast is striking. One culture responding to insecurity by building walls, another by building ships, one seeking safety in isolation, the other in movement, one defending what it had, the other acquiring what it did not. This is not to say that the Vikings never built defensive structures. In Denmark, the massive ring fortresses known as Trelleborg, circular ramparts with internal divisions forming a precise geometric pattern, show that Norse rulers could organize large-scale construction projects when they chose to. But these were exceptions rather than the rule, and they were built relatively late in the Viking Age, possibly by Harald Bluetooth, as he consolidated his control over Denmark. The Norse genius was not for fortification, but for projection of power across vast distances. The Trelleborg fortresses, perfectly circular earthworks with internal wooden buildings arranged in a geometric pattern, are remarkable for their precision and standardization. 5 have been discovered in Denmark and southern Sweden, all believed to date from the reign of Harald Bluetooth in the late 10th century. Their purpose remains debated. They may have been training camps for the armies that Harald used to unify Denmark and conquer parts of Norway, administrative centers to strengthen royal control over the provinces, or defenses against external threats, including the expanding German Empire to the south. Whatever their specific purpose, they demonstrate the organizational capacity of the late Viking Age state in Denmark, a far cry from the loosely structured raiding bands of the early period. The Viking expansion was not simply a matter of conquest, however. It was also a process of settlement, trade, and cultural exchange. In the places where they settled, whether in the Danelaw in England, Normandy in France, or Kiev in the east, the Norse gradually integrated with local populations. They adopted local religions, languages, and customs while contributing elements of their own culture. The result was not replacement, but fusion, creating new hybrid societies. In England, Norse settlement in the Danelaw left a lasting linguistic legacy. Words of Norse origin permeate modern English: sky, egg, law, husband, window, anger, they, them, their, all entered the language through contact with Norse settlers. Place names across northern and eastern England also reveal this influence. Settlements ending in, by Whitby Darby, Thorpe, Scunthorpe, or Thwaite, Braithwaite, all bear witness to Norse presence. This linguistic influence suggests not conquest and segregation, but integration and interaction. The process of integration was accelerated by conversion to Christianity. While early Viking raiders were pagans, those who settled in Christian lands typically converted, either from genuine conviction or for practical political reasons. The Treaty of Wedmore between Alfred the Great and Guthrum included Guthrum's baptism as a condition of peace. In Normandy, Rollo and his followers accepted baptism as part of their agreement with the Frankish king Charles the Simple. In Kiev, Vladimir I converted to Orthodox Christianity in 988, aligning his realm with the Byzantine cultural sphere. These conversions did not erase Norse cultural identity overnight. Pagan beliefs and practices persisted for generations in many areas, but they did facilitate integration with the surrounding Christian societies. The evidence of the sagas and archaeological findings tells us that Norse society was not uniformly warlike. The same people who raided monasteries also established far-reaching trade networks, founded cities, farmed new lands, and created art of remarkable beauty and technical sophistication. The exquisite animal interlace patterns of Norse decoration, the poetry of the skalds with its complex metaphorical language, the narrative power of the sagas, all these speak of a culture with rich aesthetic and intellectual dimensions. The Oseberg ship burial, discovered in Norway in 1904 and dating to around 834, provides extraordinary evidence of the artistic achievements of Viking Age craftsmen. The burial chamber, constructed within a ship that was then covered by a mound, contained the remains of 2 women and a wealth of grave goods, including intricately carved wooden items such as a 4-wheeled wagon, several sleds, and animal head posts. The craftsmanship displayed in these objects is of the highest quality, with dynamic animal figures and complex interlace patterns executed with remarkable skill. The Oseberg find reminds us that the Vikings were not merely warriors, but creators of a sophisticated material culture. The Norse artistic tradition, with its preference for zoomorphic designs and interlace patterns, developed over centuries, absorbing influences from Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, Frankish, and Byzantine sources while maintaining its distinctive character. The so-called gripping beast motif, in which animal figures grasp each other or the borders of the design with their paws, is particularly characteristic of Viking art. These designs appear on everything from jewelry to ship carvings, from weapons to runestones, creating a visual language that was recognizably Norse despite regional variations. Equally impressive was Norse literary achievement, though this is known primarily through texts recorded centuries after the events they describe. The skaldic poetry composed during the Viking Age was preserved orally before being written down in the medieval period. This highly formal verse, with its complex meter and its use of kennings, metaphorical phrases that substitute for straightforward terms such as Odin's flame for sword or sea steed for ship, suggests a sophisticated literary culture. The sagas, written primarily in Iceland from the 12th century onward, preserve not only historical accounts, but a wealth of cultural information about Viking Age society, from legal practices to religious beliefs to everyday customs. Archaeological evidence from Norse settlements across their expanded world, from Dublin to Novgorod, from York to Lonsdale Meadows, shows a people adapting to diverse environments while maintaining connections to their cultural roots. Artifacts found in these widely separated locations show both local adaptation and continuing links to Scandinavian traditions. In York, excavations at Coppergate revealed workshops producing goods in Norse styles, but using local materials, suggesting craftsmen who had settled permanently but maintained their traditional skills and aesthetic preferences. The Viking settlement of Dublin, established in the mid-9th century, became one of the largest slave markets in Europe and a major center for trade between Ireland and the wider Viking world. Excavations in the Wood Quay area of modern Dublin have revealed the remains of Viking Age buildings, wharves, and numerous artifacts, including items made locally and others imported from as far away as the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. The settlement pattern shows a planned urban layout, with rectangular plots fronting onto streets that led down to the river, a design that facilitated both defense and commercial activity. In Russia, the early Rus settlements show a similar pattern of cultural fusion. At sites like Staraya Ladoga, Novgorod, and Kiev, archaeological evidence reveals a material culture that combines Scandinavian and Slavic elements. Over time, the Norse ruling elite became increasingly Slavicized, adopting local languages and customs while maintaining political dominance. By the mid-11th century, the Rurikid princes were fully integrated into the Slavic cultural world. Though they maintained diplomatic and commercial ties to Scandinavia, the name Rus itself, originally denoting the Swedish Vikings who established the first trading posts in the region, came to be applied to the East Slavic state they founded and eventually to the people who inhabited it. The Heimskringla, a collection of sagas compiled by the Icelandic poet and historian Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, provides a literary window into how the Norse themselves understood their history. Though written centuries after many of the events it describes and certainly embellished for dramatic effect, it portrays Norse kings not simply as warriors, but as statesmen navigating complex political realities, as lawgivers and community builders. The sagas depict a society that valued not only martial prowess, but also eloquence, wisdom, and justice. Snorri's account of Harald Fairhair's unification of Norway, for instance, presents a ruler motivated not only by ambition, but by a vision of a more orderly society. According to the saga, Harald vowed not to cut or comb his hair until he had become sole ruler of Norway. After achieving this goal through a combination of military victories and diplomatic marriages, he had his previously unkempt hair cut and was given the nickname Fairhair. While the historical accuracy of this story is questionable, it reflects the Norse understanding of kingship as a transformative role, one that brought order to a previously fragmented society. Similarly, the Heimskringla's account of Olaf Tryggvason's efforts to Christianize Norway in the late 10th century portrays a complex figure who combined forceful methods with personal charisma in his mission to transform Norse religious practice. The saga describes how Olaf would arrive at a Thing assembly with a large force of men, making it clear that resistance to his religious policies would have consequences, but also how he would engage in theological debates and offer material incentives for conversion. The historical Olaf may have been more straightforwardly coercive than his saga portrayal suggests, but the narrative reveals how later Norse writers understood the process of cultural transformation, seeing it as involving both power and persuasion. As the Viking Age progressed, the nature of Norse interaction with the wider world changed. The shock and terror of the early raids gave way to more complex relationships. In England, the peace treaty between Alfred the Great and the Viking leader Guthrum in 886 established the boundaries of the Danelaw and included Guthrum's baptism as a Christian. This marked the beginning of a process by which the Norse in England would gradually be integrated into Anglo-Saxon society and religious structures. The Treaty of Wedmore, or Chippenham, signed after Alfred's victory over Guthrum at the Battle of Edington in 878, established a boundary between Wessex and the Danelaw along the line of Watling Street, the old Roman road running from London to Chester. To the north and east of this line, in the Danelaw, Norse law and custom would prevail. To the south and west, Anglo-Saxon traditions would continue. The treaty was sealed by Guthrum's baptism, with Alfred standing as his godfather, creating a spiritual kinship between the former enemies. This religious dimension was not merely symbolic but practical, bringing the Norse leader into the Christian moral and political framework that dominated Western Europe. Similar processes occurred elsewhere. In Normandy, The Viking leader Rollo received lands from the Frankish king Charles the Simple in 911 in exchange for defending the region against other raiders and accepting baptism. Within a few generations, his descendants had transformed from Norse adventurers into French-speaking Norman aristocrats, though they retained something of the Viking spirit of conquest, as their expeditions to England, southern Italy, and the Holy Land would demonstrate. The treaty between Charles the Simple and Rollo, concluded at Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, granted the Viking leader what would become the core territories of Normandy, roughly equivalent to the modern French department of Seine-Maritime. In return, Rollo pledged to defend the region against other Viking raiders and to convert to Christianity. Like the Treaty of Wedmore, this agreement used Christian conversion as a mechanism for integrating a Norse leader into the existing political order. The baptism of Rollo, who took the Christian name Robert, and his followers represented not only a religious change, but a political realignment, transforming them from external threats to stakeholders in the Frankish political system. The conversion of Scandinavia itself to Christianity was a gradual process, beginning in Denmark under Harald Bluetooth in the mid-10th century, and spreading to Norway under Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Morxes. Olaf, around the turn of the millennium. Sweden's conversion came somewhat later, not being substantially complete until the 12th century. These religious changes were not merely spiritual, but had profound political implications, integrating the Norse kingdoms into the broader European community of Christian states. Harald Bluetooth's conversion, commemorated in the famous Jelling runestone that he erected, marked a significant political as well as religious shift. The inscription reads, "King Harald ordered this monument made in memory of Gorm his father and Thyra his mother, that Harald, who won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christians." The stone, with its runic inscription, crucifixion image, and traditional Norse decorative elements, embodied the cultural synthesis that was occurring as the Norse world entered the orbit of Christian Europe. Harald's conversion was likely influenced by political considerations. The growing power of the German Empire to the south made alignment with Christian Europe increasingly advantageous, but it set in motion changes that would transform Scandinavian society. In Norway, the process of Christianization was more violent, with kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson using force to impose the new religion. The sagas record how Olaf Tryggvason dealt with those who resisted conversion. Some were mutilated, others drowned, while those who agreed to baptism were rewarded with gifts and favor. These methods were not unique to the Norse context. Across Europe, conversion was often a top-down process in which rulers compelled their subjects to adopt the new faith. What was distinctive about the Norwegian case was the strength of resistance in some regions, particularly among those who saw Christianity not merely as a new religious option, but as an attack on a way of life closely tied to the old gods. The conversion of Iceland followed a different pattern. At the Althing in the year 1000, as tensions between pagans and Christians threatened to erupt into open conflict, the assembly entrusted the decision about which religion to follow to the law speaker, Thorgeir Thorkelsson, a pagan. After a day and a night of reflection, Thorgeir announced that Iceland would become Christian, though with certain concessions to pagan sensibilities. Private worship of the old gods would still be permitted, as would the exposure of unwanted infants and the eating of horseflesh, practices that the Church generally condemned. This compromise allowed for a relatively peaceful transition, avoiding the religious warfare that might have torn the fragile Icelandic society apart. By the mid-11th century, the Viking Age was drawing to a close. The year 1066 provides a convenient endpoint, with Harald Hardrada's failed invasion of England marking the last major Viking military venture in the West. The factors that had made the Norse expansion possible were changing. The consolidation of power in Scandinavia meant fewer independent chieftains seeking fortunes abroad. The strengthening of states throughout Europe with improved defensive systems, including those stone castles, made raiding less profitable and more dangerous, and the conversion to Christianity altered the cultural dynamics that had underpinned the earlier Norse worldview. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, where Harold Hardrada was defeated by the English king Harold Godwinson on September 25, 1066, marked the end of an era. Harold, who had served in the Varangian Guard and ruled Norway with a firm hand, led a substantial force to England, claiming the throne based on an agreement with a previous king. He initially achieved success, defeating an English force at Gate Fulford on September 20th, but was caught by surprise when Harold Godwinson marched his army nearly 200 miles in just 4 days to confront the invaders. The battle was fierce, with heavy casualties on both sides, but ended with Harold's death and the defeat of his forces. According to the sagas, he was killed by an arrow to the throat after fighting bravely in the thick of the battle. Just 3 weeks later, Harold Godwinson himself would be defeated and killed at the Battle of Hastings by William of Normandy, whose claim to the English throne was no more valid than Harold's had been, but whose military fortune proved better. The Norman conquest would transform England, introducing a new aristocracy, a new language of administration, Norman French, and a new style of architecture, including those stone castles that would become such a defining feature of the medieval landscape. The conquest represented both an end and a continuation of Viking influence, an end to direct Norse intervention in English affairs, but a continuation of the Norse impact through the medium of the Normanized descendants of Rollo's followers. But the legacy of the Viking Age extends far beyond its chronological boundaries. The Norman conquest of England, itself an indirect product of Viking expansion, as the Normans were descendants of Norse settlers in France, would transform English society, language, and governance. The Rus's states in the east would evolve into entities that would shape Russian and Ukrainian history for centuries to come. Iceland would preserve the literary and legal traditions of the Norse in its sagas and its Althing, the parliament that traces its roots to the Viking Age. And the brief Norse presence in North America would remain as a tantalizing hint of what might have been, had history taken a different course. When we look at medieval castles today, the stone keeps and curtain walls that seem to embody the Middle Ages in popular imagination, we are seeing only one response to the challenges of that turbulent time. While some built walls, others built ships. While some sought security in isolation, others found it in mobility and adaptation. The Vikings remind us that there is more than one way to face an uncertain world, that walls are not the only answer to insecurity, and that sometimes the boldest course is not to shelter behind stone, but to set sail for distant horizons. The medieval chroniclers who recorded the Viking raids often portrayed the Norse as God's punishment for the sins of Christian Europe. But viewed from our distant vantage point, we can see them as something more complex. Not simply destroyers, but also creators, not just conquerors, but colonizers, not merely warriors, but explorers, traders, settlers, and artists. In their longships, they connected worlds that had previously existed in isolation, creating networks of exchange that would outlast their own distinctive culture. In Iceland, the settlement of which began around 874, the Norse established what some historians have called the first modern republic. The Althing, established in 930, was an assembly where disputes were settled and laws made, a place where even chieftains were subject to collective decision-making. This political innovation occurred in a remote volcanic island, while much of Europe was still organized around personal bonds of feudal loyalty. The Icelanders would go on to create one of the richest literary traditions of medieval Europe in their sagas, preserving not only their own history, but much of what we know about Norse mythology and the early history of Scandinavia. The Icelandic sagas, composed primarily in the 13th and 14th centuries, represent a unique literary achievement. Unlike the chivalric romances and saints' lives that dominated continental European literature of the period, the sagas are prose narratives focused on the lives of ordinary people, farmers, merchants, poets, outlaws, as well as kings and heroes. They combine realistic detail about everyday life with supernatural elements, historical events with literary invention. The saga of the people of Lexardal, the saga of Grettir the Strong, Niall's saga, Egil's saga. These and many others provide a window into the Norse world that is unparalleled in its richness and complexity. Though written centuries after the events they describe and certainly shaped by the Christian perspective of their authors, they preserve elements of the pagan Norse worldview and social structure that would otherwise be lost to history. Far to the east, the Russes' contribution to state formation would have equally profound consequences. The Rurikid dynasty, founded by the semi-legendary Viking leader Rurik, would rule various Russian principalities until the late 16th century. Kiev, under leaders with names that reveal their Norse origins, Oleg, Igor, Olga, would become one of the great cities of early medieval Europe, a center of trade and culture, where Byzantine, Slavic, and Norse influences blended. The complex relationship between these eastern Viking states and their neighbors, the Byzantine Empire, the various nomadic peoples of the steppe, and later the Mongol Empire, would shape the distinctive character of Russian civilization. The primary chronicle records how Princess Olga, widow of Igor, and regent for her son Sviatoslav, traveled to Constantinople in 957 and was baptized as a Christian, taking the name Helena after the mother of Constantine the Great. This marked the beginning of Byzantine cultural influence in Kievan Rus', though widespread conversion would not occur until the reign of her grandson Vladimir. The chronicle also relates how Vladimir, seeking a suitable religion for his realm, sent emissaries to investigate various faith traditions. Those who visited the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople reported back, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. For on earth there is no such splendor or such beauty, and we are at a loss to describe it. We only know that God dwells there among men." This aesthetic and spiritual response to Byzantine Christianity would influence the development of Russian Orthodoxy, with its emphasis on the beauty of worship as a reflection of divine glory. In the North Atlantic, Norse exploration reached beyond Greenland to North America, as confirmed by the archaeological site at L'Anseau Meadows in Newfoundland. The sagas tell of Leif Eriksson's voyage to Vinland around the year 1000 and of subsequent attempts to establish a permanent settlement there. These efforts ultimately failed, apparently due to conflicts with the indigenous people and the challenges of maintaining such a remote outpost. But the very fact of this transatlantic voyage, 5 centuries before Columbus, testifies to the extraordinary maritime capabilities and adventurous spirit of the Norse. The Viking settlement at L'Anseau Meadows, discovered in 1960 and dated to around the year 1000, consists of 8 buildings constructed in the typical Norse style, with turf walls and timber frames. The site appears to have been occupied for only a few years, serving perhaps as a base for further exploration rather than a permanent colony. Artifacts found there, including a bronze pin used for fastening cloaks and a stone spindle whorl used in spinning wool, are distinctly Norse in character. The location, at the northernmost tip of Newfoundland, would have provided access to the rich marine resources of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, while allowing for further exploration down the coast. The Greenland colony, established by Eric the Red around 985, was more substantial and long-lasting, surviving until the mid-15th century. At its peak, it consisted of 2 main settlements, the eastern settlement near modern Qaqortoq and the smaller western settlement near Nuuk, with a total population estimated at around 2,000 to 3,000 people. The settlers lived primarily by raising livestock, supplemented by hunting, especially seals and caribou, and limited agriculture. They maintained contact with Iceland and, less frequently, with Norway, trading walrus ivory, furs, and live polar bears for timber, iron, and other goods that could not be produced locally. The eventual abandonment of the colony has been attributed to various factors, including climate change. The onset of the Little Ice Age made agriculture increasingly difficult, economic marginalization, as the European market for walrus ivory declined, and possibly conflicts with the Thule Inuit, who were expanding into Greenland during this period. The cultural impact of the Vikings extends into modern times, though often in forms that would be unrecognizable to the Norse themselves. The romanticized image of the Viking, the horned helmet which historical Vikings never wore, the berserker fury, the longship with dragon prow, has become a staple of popular culture, appearing in everything from Wagner's operas to modern films, television series, and video games. More subtly, but perhaps more significantly, elements of Norse mythology have permeated Western culture through works like J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, which draws heavily on Norse sources. The revival of interest in Viking history and culture began in the 18th and 19th centuries as part of the broader Romantic movement's fascination with medieval and pre-Christian traditions. In Scandinavia, this revival was linked to emerging nationalism, as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden sought to define their distinct cultural identities. The Old Norse literary corpus, particularly the Eddic poems with their accounts of gods and heroes, provided material for artists, composers, and writers seeking to create distinctively national forms of expression. Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle, though based on German rather than Scandinavian sources, drew heavily on Norse mythology, introducing figures like Odin, Wotan, and the Valkyries to a broader European audience. In the lands that were once part of the Viking world, their legacy is remembered in various ways. In the Isle of Man, the Tynwald, the island's parliament, traces its origins to the Norse Thing system and still conducts part of its annual ceremony in the open air, as the Vikings did. In York, once the capital of the Viking kingdom of Jorvik, museums and archaeological sites celebrate this heritage. In Russia, the role of the Varangians in state formation remains a topic of scholarly debate and national identity. The relationship between the Vikings and castle-building cultures was not simply one of contrast, but of complex interaction. As Norse raiders became settlers and then rulers in places like Normandy, they adopted and adapted the defensive architecture of their new homes. The Normans, descended from Vikings but thoroughly Christianized and French-speaking by the 11th century, would become some of the greatest castle builders in Europe. After the Norman conquest of 1066, William the Conqueror and his followers transformed the landscape of England with their motte and bailey castles, establishing a network of control that the earlier Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had never achieved. The transition from timber to stone castles, which began in the late 11th century and accelerated through the 12th, represented a significant investment in permanent defensive structures. The Tower of London, begun under William the Conqueror as a timber fortification and rebuilt in stone under his son William Rufus, exemplifies this evolution. The White Tower, the central keep of the complex, still stands as a monument to Norman power and architectural skill. Similar stone keeps were constructed throughout England, from Newcastle in the north to Dover in the south, creating a network of royal fortresses that secured Norman control over the conquered territory. These stone castles, with their massive walls and imposing profiles, required enormous resources to build and maintain. They represented a statement of permanent authority, a declaration that the Normans intended not merely to raid or temporarily occupy, but to rule for generations to come. They also reflected a changing military technology as siege warfare became more sophisticated and defensive architecture evolved in response. The castle became not merely a stronghold, but a center of administration, a visible symbol of lordship, and a focal point for the economic and social life of the surrounding region. In this sense, the Viking Age does not simply oppose the age of castles, but evolves into it. The energy that had once propelled longships across uncharted seas now raised stone towers and curtain walls. The organizational capacity that had coordinated fleets of raiders now directed the construction of massive defensive works. The Norse hunger for new territories found expression in the Norman conquests of England, Sicily, and parts of the Holy Land. The Vikings did not so much disappear as transform, their distinctive culture blending into the broader tapestry of medieval European civilization. What endures from the Viking Age is not just the physical artifacts, the ships buried at Oseberg and Gokstad, the silver hoards found throughout their sphere of influence, the runestones that commemorate their dead, but also a certain spirit of exploration and adaptation. In an age when most Europeans rarely traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, the Norse created networks spanning thousands of miles. In a time when most societies were deeply conservative, clinging to established ways in the face of a precarious existence, the Vikings showed remarkable adaptability, absorbing influences from the diverse cultures they encountered while maintaining their own distinctive identity. The archaeological record testifies to this adaptive capacity. At Birka, a trading center in Sweden that flourished from the 8th to the 10th century, excavations have revealed artifacts from as far away as the Byzantine Empire, the Islamic world, and even India, suggesting a commercial network of remarkable extent. The burials at Birka include individuals dressed in Eastern European, Central Asian, and Byzantine styles, indicating a cosmopolitan community where diverse cultural influences were welcomed. Similar evidence comes from other Viking Age trading centers, from Dublin in the west to Novgorod in the east, all showing the Norse talent for creating connections across vast distances and cultural boundaries. As we look back across the centuries at these northern explorers, what stands out is not only what they built, the settlements, the trading posts, the new societies in distant lands, but also what they overcame. In their open boats, they crossed the storm-tossed North Atlantic, navigating by the stars, the sun, and their accumulated knowledge of winds and currents. They endured hardships that would have defeated less resilient people, establishing colonies in the marginal environments of Iceland and Greenland. They adapted to new circumstances while carrying their cultural memory with them, preserving it in the oral traditions that would eventually be written down as sagas. The navigational achievements of the Vikings are all the more remarkable, given the limited technology available to them. They had no magnetic compass, no sextant, no chronometer for determining longitude. Instead, they relied on a deep understanding of natural signs, the behavior of birds, the color and movement of water, the position of the sun and stars when visible. They used a simple but effective instrument called a sun shadow board, which allowed them to determine latitude by measuring the sun's elevation above the horizon. And perhaps most importantly, they accumulated and passed down detailed knowledge of routes, landmarks, and sailing conditions, creating a collective navigational wisdom that enabled voyages of astonishing range and precision. In our modern world, where walls and barriers are still being built to separate people and cultures, the Viking legacy offers a different perspective, one that values connection over isolation, mobility over fixity, and adaptation over rigid adherence to tradition. This is not to romanticize the Vikings, whose expansion certainly included violence and exploitation alongside more constructive activities. But it is to recognize that their approach to an uncertain world, reaching outward rather than turning inward, created possibilities that would otherwise never have existed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, recording the Viking raid on Lindisfarne in 793, saw it as a divine punishment. In this year, dire portents appeared over Northumbria. Fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. And a little after that, the harrying of the heathen miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne. From the perspective of the Christian chroniclers, the Vikings were a scourge, a test of faith, a calamity to be endured. But history has a way of transforming our understanding. What seemed like destruction often proves to be transformation. The Viking raids and settlements, for all their initial violence, created connections that enriched European civilization. The Norse brought new blood, new ideas, and new energy to the lands they entered. They linked previously isolated regions into networks of trade and cultural exchange. They demonstrated that even the most formidable barriers, the vast expanses of open ocean, the harsh environments of the far north, the cultural and linguistic differences between peoples, could be overcome by human ingenuity, courage, and adaptability. While England built castles, the Vikings colonized half the known world. Both strategies, the defensive and the expansive, have their place in human society. Both reflect responses to the perennial challenges of security and survival. But it is worth reflecting on which approach has left the deeper mark on our collective history. The castle, standing in stolid resistance to change, or the longship venturing into the unknown with only courage and skill as protection against the elements. In the end, perhaps we need both, the anchor of tradition and the sail of exploration, the security of home and the adventure of the journey. The Viking Age reminds us that walls may protect what we have, but ships carry us to what we might become. The legacy of the Viking Age continues to resonate in our modern world, not only in the physical landmarks they left behind or in the genes of their descendants, but in the enduring fascination with their culture, their achievements, and their spirit of adventure. From the settlement of Iceland to the founding of Kiev, from the mapping of the North Atlantic to the establishment of trading networks that spanned continents, the Vikings expanded the known world and connected previously isolated regions. They remind us that the human story is not just one of building walls and defending territories, but of crossing boundaries and creating connections. As we face our own uncertain future, perhaps we can draw inspiration from these ancient mariners who dared to set their course by distant stars and ventured into the unknown with courage, skill, and an unquenchable spirit of discovery.